Hey guys, this is 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗦 with Creative Retail Talks, and I'm excited to continue our discussion with Charlie Leichtweis with Experts in How. Hi, this is 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗦. Thanks for joining the Creative Retail Talks podcast today, where we will be discussing the latest in life, business, and retail. Charlie, we're enjoying having you on the podcast for a couple of segments here, talking about your book, The Power of Respect in Business. In segment one, we had some really good discussion about the relationship side of a lot of what you talk about in the book and a lot of the stories and leadership principles from that. And you tie in the book the principles of relationships and results. And so let's spend some time in this segment talking about results. So do you want to kick us off with the second segment about kind of how those two tie together?
In terms of the concept, and it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning of the first segment, what I've learned over time is leadership is an equal emphasis on results and relationships. And as you mentioned, we talked about relationship examples, the emotional scale, et cetera, in the first section. And now I want to tie that into results. And I'll give you a little story here that's a true story, of course. I went to work as the CEO of a company that was, the labor force was United Auto Workers, UAW, union shop. And when I went there, the UAW representatives wanted to have a meeting with the new CEO, which is not protocol usually in union situations. Usually they wanted to go to human resources and operations first. And so I asked them to do that. And they came back and insisted they wanted to have a conversation with me since I was new there. And so I asked the operations head and the HR head, what did they think? And they said, well, go ahead and have a meeting with them and see what happens. So the union committee of 3 people came to sit down with me in a conference room at the plant. And they had one question for me. They said, what do you think of unions? And I said, I don't. I think that our goal here is to create sustainable profitability here in Rockford, Illinois. To do that, we have to be on the same page. To do that, we have to be profitable. We have to be flexible. And I wanted to get flexibility on the table right away in building this relationship. And I said, well, when I look out that window, I don't see union or non-union people on the floor. I see people who need a job. And I turned to them in all honesty and said, I don't know about you, but I need this job. And the point there is to build the relationship that would then lead to this concept of flexibility and measurement going forward. And we'll talk about that in a second. But of course, they nod their head that they need this relationship. So now we're essentially on the same side of the table, in essence, in terms of our goal here. We need these jobs. We want to create these jobs in a sustainable way. And now we can begin to talk about how do we do that. And so what happens there is when you build the relationship over time, or even from the beginning, you're then able to then turn your focus like a laser on results without running over people or without it being a negative that the results are something you're telling them they're not doing. So we began to look at the measurements of the business. Of course, in a manufacturing business, there's labor productivity, there's service level, which is on time and complete with respect to orders. There's accuracy, there's safety, there's quality, there's all those kinds of things. So we constructed a measurement system that included those elements in it. We said to ourselves, those are going to be our goals to measure the business on, and we need to continually communicate on how we need help doing that on either side of this conversation. And so as we went down the path there, the new union contract was coming up. And we put this process into that process as well and renegotiated a groundbreaking contract with the UAW workers in that plant. And we took what was the legacy bonuses. And I said to them, I don't want to take any money away from the bonus pools that you could earn. What I want to do is redirect them to these measurements that really relate to how the business stays open and we all do well in our jobs. And those were productivity, on time, delivery, and complete, accuracy, labor standards, and a number of other things, quality and safety, and then how you play well with others in terms of the personal side. So we set up goals for that, and we set up measurements that would work for that everybody agreed upon. Those got built into the contract, and we began to measure. And so, for example, in that case, the productivity measurement when we started was versus a standard, and we agreed not to change the standards so we could see whether we were really making improvement or not. The productivity of labor in that plant versus the standard was somewhere in the neighborhood of 44% of standard. Now, I didn't know whether the standard was wrong or not, because but we were using standards to measure our profitability by and understand our costs. So we needed to find out, and we weren't going to stop everything and do a time study. We wanted to do this real time. So we said, okay, the goal has to get from 45 to 65 to 85 to 90, and we had those gradients in there. And then we would all work together with, how do we get there? What's the underlying cause? And the process you go through with that measurement is, when you've come in contact with something that's causing that to be low, you ask yourself why. It's the root cause. It's a typical analysis of going through why until you get to the root cause. A fishbone analysis is called in statistics, probably. And you work together to eliminate or mitigate those barriers. And what has happened is, we did that. First of all, people believed we cared in what they were doing. We cared in how they were doing it. So the relationship side was really beginning to kick in. And as a result, we focused on that productivity level, and it went from 44-ish% all the way up to 85% within a year, which is actually exceeding our first initial. And we found all kinds of root causes, and it wasn't about blaming anybody. So we said, okay, let's look at some of the root causes in here. Well, the line doesn't start up on time in the morning. All the laborers are there, and they go to start the line. They find out they don't have the material at the line. Okay, so why don't we have the material at the line? Let's look at inventory. Well, we can't find it in the plant. Okay, so we look around, we find it in some different places, not easy to get to and not efficient relative to that line. So we begin to move things around physically. Then we find out that, well, we thought we had something in inventory we wanted, so inventory accuracy became an issue. And so we began to work on that and take counts and get to root causes of when things were put away and how, et cetera. And I know this sounds like a long story, but these are all interconnected elements that drive the why this was an issue. So that when we started to fix each of those as we went along, productivity soared. So you can imagine something as simple as, well, the line starts on time now because the material's there when the laborers are there. And it's not because somebody was doing something on purpose before.
Yeah.
And so those things, and what happened is, of course, once productivity and line time, uptime, et cetera, was coming into play properly, on time and complete delivery now became easier to do, because stuff was made on time and was made in complete batches, because you had, so all that sequence of things that have to go on across functional lines, across what I call the functional silos, which were barriers before. Now you've eliminated those barriers. People are communicating. People know how what they do in that chain of events affects the results of the business. Our on time and complete delivery, our service levels, which were, I think, in the 30% range. And we had customers like Walmart, Michaels, and others. And of course, their service level requirements are 95, 96, 97, et cetera. And people always wondered why we lost those accounts before I gotten them. And I said, once we do this, we're going to go back to them. And our on time went from 37% in less than a year to 95%. And it was at 98% very shortly after that.
Wow, that's amazing.
And it sounds like a miracle, and it was a very short period of time, but it wasn't so much a miracle as it was, okay, how do we determine what we need to know to run this business? What should be our targets, these measurements, these results, and then what affects those, and how do we help people do that?
Yeah.
And so that's a perfect example of combining results and relationships to bring a business back from the dead. We grew sales at a record level for 4 years in the worst recession in history. For that company. Now, they had a famous name brand, which helped, but nonetheless, it had to be resurrected.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I love that you said in there is you talked about blame, and that no one was looking to blame anybody. I feel like a lot of times, conversations that I have either been a part of or heard of in situations like that where something's broken and as a team we're trying to fix it. Sometimes the focus does get put on, who's to blame, who's responsible, and it becomes a headhunt instead of a collaborative, hey, let's figure out what's broken. Let's figure out the why. Let's figure out how to fix it and do it together as a team. So I love how you went about that.
And it's all connected, and people begin to take ownership. The other thing we did there, where we married relationship with results, was decided to have better communication with our folks. And so once a quarter, we had an all-company meeting, which included everybody from me, the CEO, down to the shop floor people, every shift, if you will. And we had these meetings. And when we first started those meetings, the meeting was going to begin with, I had the marketing people talk about products, and I had the salespeople talk about target markets that we were looking to invest in and make inroads in to grow the business. So in essence, it would give people hope about the cathedral we're trying to build here in terms of what we're trying to do. And they could see what we're trying to do. And then they could understand why they were being asked to do what they do with some new product configurations or new labels or whatever it may have been that they experienced on the shop floor. And we went through this process. And then at the second part of the meeting was to ask people to open up about any issues, concerns, questions they had whatsoever. When we got to the second half of that first meeting, I thought a riot was going to break out. People were shouting and screaming, this is a problem, that's a problem. You don't give me this. They're pointing to each other. They're pointing at the management team. You don't get this. And the then management team that I inherited afterwards said, boy, we don't want to have another one of these meetings. And I said, no, we exactly have to have one of these meetings. What you heard go on in there is part of the frustration of not communicating with people and understanding what their ideas was. And the thing that I told the group in total was, I said, look, everybody in here has a right to ask a question. Everybody in here has a right to get an answer. You may not always like the answer, but we're going to communicate that way openly as we go forward. And I want it to start at your department level with your department managers and supervisors. You can involve HR as you want. And ultimately, if it comes to me, that's fine as well. But we want to understand what the barriers to our success are here. And we want to be able to figure out how we engage everybody to mitigate those. And some of the simplest things come out of there you wouldn't believe.
I love that. And again, it's tying those relationships with the results and handling that the right way. Sounds like brought about great results in terms of fixing what needed to be fixed.
It did. And fixing it because the people engaged in it they cared about it, which I thought I already knew, but they also now were able to take a more specific stake in understanding how what they did affected the results and therefore the benefit of the entire organization.
Right. And another thing you mentioned that I think is such a key principle in putting strategies together like this is you tied compensation to it. It sounds like, and make sure I understood it right, but basically you took the bonus pool and said, we're going to tie those bonuses to achieving the results that we need to achieve as a company and as a team. And as we achieve those bonuses become available. Is that kind of what I heard?
Exactly right. So the new bonus structure, then there was a component for productivity, labor productivity. There was a component in there for on-time, delivery and complete. There was a component in there for safety and safety incidences and that sort of thing. There was a component in there for quality. And then there was a component in there of their own personal measurement. Each person was going to begin to get a personal evaluation. And we created a list of the attributes we wanted to have people to have in terms of how they dealt with other people and how the respect that they showed to people, a variety of attributes that we wanted to live by in our relationships and the fact. And that was the more subjective part of it, but the other ones were all measurable and specific measurements. We went through that process and that was built into the contract. And we went through that process for the first year. When we came out the end of the year, I think out of the 200 people or so on the floor, there were 6 people who weren't going to get their full bonus. And it wasn't so much because they had a problem with any of the specific measurables because the team actually made those right. But their evaluation on the personal level was that they weren't doing what they needed to. In some cases, it was some personal safety incidents as well, and carelessness, et cetera. They were coached on that. And when they couldn't perform, even in a union environment, they were going to be exited if that wouldn't work. And those 6 people asked the union to grieve this issue, and the union refused.
Interesting.
Now, there's other things where we made a calculation on safety, and attendance was in there as well. So we had made a calculation on safety that turned out to be incorrect. And they did grieve that issue in terms of how it was written and calculated, and we fixed it. And we talk about grievance in the sense of is it something special with unions? No, it's an everyday thing. It doesn't matter whether you have a union or not. If somebody says, I think something's wrong here, and you want them to say that's a grievance that you want to be able to figure out, how do I address it? Is it real? Yeah. Does it need to be fixed? If it doesn't, how do I explain it to somebody, in terms of what they need to do? And so there's nothing, it's a more formal process typically with unions, but it doesn't have to be an impersonal issue with a structure like that.
So in that situation, were you measuring leading indicators that would lead you to the final results you wanted to get?
Well, actually, we measured both leading and lagging indicators, because when you think about the indicator of being efficient to a certain level on equipment, you had to understand what are the telltale signs before that are indicators of whether you're going to get there or not. And that goes back to the fishbone analysis of what are the fingers of why in that structure that could go wrong. So, for example, again, back to the efficiency level issue, we were measuring that versus standard. We were measuring uptime on equipment and reasons for downtime. We were measuring inventory being on hand at the beginning of the shift. We're measuring inventory accuracy and a whole host of things like that mattered relative to how it would affect productivity. So in that are leading and lagging measurements that are very important to do that.
Yeah.
In fact, that's the basic concept of business intelligence. Business intelligence is rooted in the concept of leading and lagging indicators and an understanding of what data do you need to get out of your business to link to your performance that helps you understand that people can do what they need to do. And when you figure that out, then you know how to take your system, whatever it is, and it's not system constrained in terms of brand, but say, if I need this set of data, then I need to go, where does that data first come into the organization, and how do I tag it so I can get it out the way I need to in a timely and accurate way to help people get better at what they do.
So that sounds like a very successful situation. The numbers there are staggering of how you combine relationships and results. So that's a great example. What's another story out of the book that teaches a good principle that's more on the results side?
There's another one relative to understanding the way you display data and how you accumulate data in a way that's actionable. What I've developed over time, and this is not rocket science, is what I call DVPM, Direct Variable Profitability Model. And it takes an understanding of, okay, whatever the key element of the business, is it a product, is it a service, what it may be. And I used, of course, product examples, having a strong manufacturing background, and saying, okay, with respect to that product, how do I build an understanding of profitability that's measurable and actionable at all levels in the organization? And then how do I make sure I know who's assigned for the responsibility at each of those levels? So, for example, the basic building block in a manufacturing product-driven organization is going to be, and on the consumer side anyway, it's going to be an SKU or an item, particular item. And then you say, okay, within that item, typically what accountants do is they'll aggregate all kinds of costs that fully allocate it to fully load that cost. And before you know it, you have a cost that you don't understand, because you have to break it apart in the sense that you have to disaggregate it. What's truly variable driven by that unit at that level. And so materials clearly are, direct labor would be, some elements of packaging may be, et cetera, at that level. And you stop there for a second and say, okay, this is the variable contribution margin at the level of the individual unit. As you can see, then you can build this block up. Any part of the business includes multiple levels of those. You aggregate those units and you have a direct variable profitability model. Then you go from product level to the level that says, what about the customer level? And then you say, okay, so I've got a customer here and I've got all the products that I now have individual contribution margin. That comes over as the first part of that P&L for that customer. Then I have to say, what programs do I have or other elements that are specific and directly related to that particular customer? Do I have a discount program specifically related to that customer? Do I have an advertising or a co-op program specifically for that advertising? And we begin to build those in to get the direct customer level profitability. Then we say, okay, what's the market profitability within that market? And the market may be food and drug, and you may have a bunch of several food and several drug customers, and you aggregate their individual contribution margins into the market level, and you build from there, and you keep going. And at some point in time, you're going to find there's a whole bunch of costs that you're not going to allocate, and they're not directly related to the actual reason you're in business, which is servicing customers. It's typically known as overhead, not a bad word. I consider it to be support head, to be able to support the business. And so now you get into certain things where there's going to be headcount in human resources, maybe in finance, maybe the fixed headcount in marketing that's not directly related to a specific customer channel or market, and you say, okay, now I've got these pools of fixed costs, leave them on their own and say to yourself, if I've identified these other pools that affect profitability, my next question is, for my organization, do I know who personally is responsible for each of those pools? Because if some of those pools don't have a person responsible, then you know you've got a problem, because there's no hope of really managing that.
Yeah.
Typically, when you allocate all those up into a product level, you can't find where they are or whether they're being measured or not. And then in those cases, you measure those on a budgeted basis or some other activity level that drives those, because the actual individual unit of product isn't going to drive your human resources. Maybe the number of people you have there, maybe the complication of a healthcare or a comp plan does, et cetera, et cetera. So you find their own levels of activity at that to measure them, and you make sure there's at least somebody in your organization that's directly responsible for measuring, reporting on that, and assessing whether there's value added in that spend. When you add all that up, it becomes a total enterprise profitability. When you break it down like that, it still has to equal the financial statements that the accountants put out in total, top and bottom line. Very different in between.
And I believe, if I remember right, the principle here is to help companies stop doing what they're not getting paid for. Is that right? Am I remembering that right?
Yeah. I've told many companies we have to stop doing what we're not getting paid for. So if we're building a product that has BMW technology in it, and we're trying to sell it to somebody who's starting out as their first job and they need transportation for 3 miles a day, that doesn't match up. The cost of the technology at the higher level is not worth what the true customer is willing to or needs to pay for what they need to get done with that product.
So it helps narrow the focus, I guess, to some degree on what's profitable and what makes sense.
Right. And there's nothing wrong with it. And again, nobody's to blame when you say we're going to stop doing what we don't get paid for. Now you're still focusing on the customer. If the customer doesn't want to pay for that, there's no reason for us to keep doing it, as opposed to saying, you, Mr. Manager or Miss Manager, you're spending more than you should. I mean, what can you do with that statement? If somebody was told that about their, what are they going to do on their own? What can they do? That's not an actionable statement. But when the customer says, I don't need this technology or that design or what have you, then you know what the answer is. And you go back to your organization and find out where that creates costs, and you're able to change them or repurpose those costs.
So Charlie, before we wrap up this segment, there's a story in the book that you tell about connecting the dots. And I think I remember something about a golf swing. Can you share that one with us before we wrap up here?
I would have to say that's probably a lifelong struggle. The golf swing.
Yeah.
But I think
saying me too.
But the reality is, I started thinking about, connecting the dots, which is incorporates sharing knowledge and data across functions and points of interest that you need to in an organization. But the example of the golf swing came to mind as I sit there going, okay, so the golf swing involves, your grip, it involves your posture, it involves your takeaway, it involves a whole bunch of things that are connected. Individually, you could try to perfect them, but if you don't relate them to one another, you will not have a golf swing that can produce a result. And so if you sit there and go, well, here's the perfect grip. Well, is it or isn't it? It depends on the circumstance of the environment you're standing in, depends on your stance, depends on which direction you want to shape the ball, et cetera, et cetera. So it takes an understanding of all of those elements. The department that handles the grip in your organization, the department that handles the type of club you're going to use, the part that handles what your stance should be, and figure out how all those come to bear with respect to the target in mind that you're aiming at, and then coordinate them that way. And if you don't connect those dots, those silos of points of interest in your business will never be connected in a way for you to execute sustainable, profitable growth with your customers.
Well, Charlie, there is so much wisdom in the power of respect in business. And I know you do so much with experts in how to help companies figure out the how and really improve their businesses. Just a couple of last questions for you. One, when someone puts The Power of Respect in Business down after reading it, what's the one thing you hope they take away?
I hope they take away a perspective that learning how is not a problem, and nobody knows how before they actually start doing things. The intention of this book was to help them hear about and see things that I've seen over time that if I maybe have known earlier, might made me more effective earlier. So I want them to think about, they hear all these different stories. They're not all going to resonate with people. I'm hoping when they put it down, they remember one story or two stories and others think, that's actually like me or my situation. And now I have an example of how to do it differently.
Yeah.
And that's really what I'm hoping people will get out of the book.
And how do people get a copy of the book?
Well, it's available on Amazon. You can go directly to Amazon, The Power of Respect in Business, by myself, Charlie Leichtweis. You can also visit our website, 𝗧𝗔𝗞𝗘𝗔𝗪𝗦, and within that website, there's a section on books, and you can go to that page and click on that. It'll take you to an order ability through Amazon as well. It's also available on 𝗧𝗪𝗏noble.com and a few others. But I think Amazon is probably the most universal looked at one.
Great. And we'll put a link to your website in the show notes so that anyone listening that wants to go check out that website can do that. And they can buy the book and reach out to you for a true expert in how.
Thank you so much, Clint. I hope this brings value to your audience, and I look forward to hearing anybody who would like some help.
Charlie, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation on the Creative Retail Talks podcast today. Be sure to visit our show notes page for more information on today's show. And if you'd like to be a guest on the podcast, reach out to me at clint@creativeretailtalks.com. Creative Retail Talks is all one word. That email address will also be in the show notes. Hope you have a great day.